Hi, this is Fafadino, and you are watching Fafadino TV on Global Insights Media. Recently, we've been hearing protests that is happening in Kenya, and Kenya is one of the countries that does not make news internationally, especially when it comes to protests. However, over the last few weeks, we've seen protests, we've seen gunshots, killing of people on the streets, and even in the Parliament House. This week, we have here with us a personality from Kenya. And because of security reasons, we wouldn't like to display or disclose his identity. Quickly, we are not going to waste much time. We are going to delve into the conversation and talk about everything that is happening in Kenya. I do believe a lot of questions has been going on. What is causing this whole thing? How are the people faring? And lots more. So without wasting my time, welcome, sir.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here.
I'm glad and I'm humbled to have you here. How was your flight coming here?
My flight was good, though a bit long, and Paris is extremely hot for this time of the year, so it's been a tough time acclimatizing to this, but everything is well.
That's good to know. We would like to know, before this whole protests, how was life in Kenya like?
Well, Kenya has always been a majorly peaceful country. Even when we have had political turbulence, it has been solved within a matter of months. And we have never had the situation that happens in most African countries of protracted war. But everything has changed. But now it's radically different. We have an administration that has managed to elicit anger from the population like no other politician and no other government has before. Before the protests in 2024, when they initially began, Kenya was in a state where we had a president that was continuously pilfering the public coffers. He was a corrupt person. He was an immoral person. And people were getting fed up with the actions of this administration. It was only a matter of time before people went to the streets. And that is what exactly happened on June 25th, 2024.
Okay, so when you're talking about he being a corrupt and immoral person, what is your definition for a person being immoral in this context?
Yes, so a bit of backstory. In 2007-2008, Kenya had a disputed election, and after the disputed election, both sides went to the streets to protest the election results. This quickly deteriorated into violence and ethnic clashes where the tribal groups of the opposition and the tribal groups of the government fought. It was the worst violence that Kenya had seen since independence, and more than 1,000 people lost their lives, with tens of thousands more being displaced from their homes, never to return again. Shortly after this, the ICC, the International Criminal Court, opened up investigations into who was the perpetrator of these ethnic clashes. Now, the current president was one of the people indicted by the ICC for crimes against humanity perpetrated during the 2007-2008 post-election violence. Despite this, in 2013, he was elected to the position of deputy president in Kenya. Now, this is a symbol of how people had so soon forgotten the trauma of the post-election violence. But even worse than that, 10 years later, in 2022, this man was now elected president. If this is not a sign of immorality, then I don't know what is.
Okay, I get you now. Now let's move to. So if I understand you well, before the protests, Kenya was a very peaceful country, as you said. Now in 2024. There was a bill that was passed, and this bill seeks to help develop the country, the financial bill of 2024. You can correct me if I'm wrong. This bill, I believe, and people are saying, is the cause of all these protests. First of all, is it true? And if it's not true, can you tell us more about the cause of this whole protests?
Yes, it is the immediate cause of the protest. But just to contextualize the situation a bit, because people normally get confused when you talk about the causes of events. You have immediate causes or sudden triggers and more long-term causes. You know, for example, in World War I, we're normally told that the shooting of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand triggered World War I. But the long-term cause was that there was a simmering tension between the European countries. The same thing happened here. The Finance Bill 2024 was the immediate cause, but long before that, we had a president who had come into power promising economic liberation for the masses. He had come in with a hustler narrative, a bottom-up narrative that promised to right the wrongs of previous administration by making sure the concerns of the working classes were more properly prioritized. But then what happened when he got into office? None of that happened. He threw all of his campaign promises out of the window. We continued to see things that we saw in past administrations. Government ministries were losing money to corruption every year. The Auditor General was producing reports that, again, public coffers were being looted by the government. There were no economic reforms for the working classes. Just before the Finance Bill 2024, in 2023, he had introduced new taxes on the working classes in the form of a housing levy. Presumably, this housing levy was supposed to help people own their own publicly subsidized homes in the future. But until 2025, none of the people have seen these benefits, despite the fact that every month there's a housing levy that is being deducted from their paychecks.
Hold on. With the housing levy, is it supposed to be a sort of a state housing where any individual can own apartments, a government own apartments, and like pay lesser or cheaper for it?
Yes, that is exactly what it was supposed to be.
Okay.
And so naturally, we have followed the implementation of this project, and 3 years down the line, we have people who have not seen the benefits of this project. We have reports of this project going over budget. We have reports of the money that was allocated to this project suddenly disappearing. We have seen the building stalled in several projects. So again, this is a sign of the government's mode of operation. They promise that a certain tax or a certain monetary deduction from your paycheck is going to help develop the country. They institute the tax, and then we don't see the benefits of those taxes. So we're in a situation where the government keeps telling us there's no money to pay for these projects. Then they get more money from us, and they still don't pursue these projects.
So I still want us to understand the build of the financial bill of 2024. Was it only deducted by people who are government workers? You just mentioned that it was taken from their check at the end of the month, if I heard you well. So was it only that for people who were government workers, or anybody who is a citizen of Kenya? Let me take you to Ghana. I think in Ghana 2023, 2024, there was a similar bill that was introduced called the e-levy. And the e-levy was supposed to be taxed on every transaction that you make. So if you send a mobile money transaction to a person, they deduct you, the receiver also get deducted. And we Ghanaians were not seeing any difference. We're not seeing any improvement in the country. So I want to understand. And that e-levy tax was only limited to any transactions that you do. It didn't involve you buying fuel. It didn't involve you buying shirts or anything from the store. However, there were other taxes too. So just to be clear, with the Financial Bill 2024 that was introduced in Kenya, how was it like? If you can explain so that the viewers, the audience can understand what actually went into the bill of the Financial Bill 2024.
Definitely. So I began by talking about the housing levy, and that came in 2023. Now, before 2024, some of the public activists went to the court system to challenge the 2023 bill that had the provisions of the financial levy. They actually ruled that it was unconstitutional for the president to impose such taxes. But the president ignored those court orders, and the 2023 housing levy continues to be effective. And so this is the backdrop to 2024. When the new Finance Bill 2024 came out, the president had increased the taxes on citizens by a factor of about 7, 8, or even 10. This is because in addition to the housing levy, there were new taxes that were being levied. For example, there was an excise duty, that was being levied on mobile money transactions similar to the one that you just described. And this is this is actually very important, because you need to understand that Kenya is a country that does not operate mostly on a bank system like most Western countries, but it has a mobile money system. This is because majority of the population is unbanked. But in order for them to access financial services such as loans, to pay for goods and services, they need access to money. And because of this, we have M-Pesa. M-Pesa is a mobile money money wallet system where you can transact money simply by having a SIM card and a phone number. And so if you introduce taxes on these transactions, you are putting a dent in the financial pockets of millions of ordinary Americans who,
Kenyans?
millions of ordinary Kenyans who are using this system to run their daily lives, to run their businesses, to send money to friends and family. And so this is one of the major taxes that was introduced. One of the other taxes that was introduced was an eco levy. Now you understand that in the current world there is a significant emphasis on the effects of climate change and the duty to mitigate climate change. And because of this, governments are imposing taxes such as carbon taxes, where you pay for pollutions. For example, when you buy a car, when you buy fuel. Now again, the intentions are well-meaning, but the effect is disastrous. This is because, again, people still need to use cars to transport themselves from one place to another. Even if you do not own a car and use public transport, the public transport fares are going to be hiked in order to take into account the levy on the petroleum. Also, goods and services are going to become expensive because they also rely on transportation from the place of supply to the place of sale. So prices are going to go up across the board because of those petroleum levies. There are other eco levies that were also introduced, for example, on sanitary pads, because sanitary pads also contain some materials that are harmful to the environment. But again, this does not take into account the fact that you have millions of women who are struggling because of lack of access to these sanitary pads. And so apart from making the situation worse for Kenyans, it also perpetuates the gender imbalances, because you're also introducing a tax on womanhood, for example. The tax also then extended to medical equipment like dialysis machines, like machines that are used to treat cancer patients. And then this also now makes the price of those treatments even higher for people who cannot already afford them. So these are just some of the taxes that really elicited a lot of rage in Kenyans. Not because Kenyans do not want to pay taxes. It is because Kenyans would like to pay taxes if they can see those taxes working for them. To give you an example, I come to France regularly, and when I come to France, I can afford to stay about 1 hour 30 minutes from Paris, because I can rely on the public transportation system to get me reliably to Paris, to and from every day. I cannot do the same in Kenya. If I were paying 45% of my paycheck as a tax in France, I would be okay with it, because I can get that public transport. I can see it working for me.
You see value for your money.
I see value for my money. I can go to the hospital and get treated. I have already experienced the French, social security service that helps you to get medical services. I would gladly pay for it. In Kenya, it's different. We don't have those public transport. Our public schools are in a continuous state of disrepair. Our hospitals are not working. The NHIF, which is the National Health Insurance Service, is corrupt. It does not pay out claims. And even then, the government wants to dismantle it to introduce another system, the Social Health Insurance Fund, which increases the premiums that you pay out of your paycheck every month, but then reduces the amount of services that you're entitled to. So we already had a system that was not working, and we decided to dismantle that system to make it even worse, which we did not think was possible, but apparently it is.
Okay, so before the whole protest thing, was there any channel that maybe the people involved in the protests tried to send their message across that we Kenyans are suffering, hence these things should be done for us? I don't know if the people protesting is an organization or it involves the whole citizenry. That is what I want us to know, and viewers want to know as well. And prior to that, has there been any channels that you've tried to communicate through to help solve all this issue?
I am glad you asked that question, and that leads me to 2 points that I do want to make concerning the questions. Now, the first thing is, whenever there is a protest or whenever there is any violent revolution throughout history against a government, one of the things that people always ask is, Aren't there more peaceful channels? Aren't there more constitutional channels for you to go through to effect changes in policies rather than going to the streets, rather than causing violence? And the thing is, yes, we have such channels, but if the government in charge does not respect those channels, then what else is left to do?
Did you actually try to use those channels?
Yes.
Okay.
So firstly, as I previously stated, we had people who went to court to challenge the previous iterations of the finance bill, for example, in 2023, which imposed new taxes on Kenyans. These courts declared that these provisions were unconstitutional. Did the government respect these court orders that declared these provisions of those finance acts unconstitutional? No, they did not. So you have a situation where under the Constitution, you can challenge the decisions and the actions of the government through the court system by a system called judicial review, where you apply to a court to scrutinize the constitutionality of an act of parliament or of a decision of a government administrator. The court can then issue an order to quash that decision if it finds it to be unconstitutional. That is the legal way to go about it, not only in Kenya but in many other systems. But now what happens if the government does not respect those court orders? We are seeing, if I could use a more famous example, the situation of the Trump administration, which is deporting people contrary to court orders. If the court already decides that such an order is unconstitutional, but the government, which has the monopoly of violence, they have the police, they have the administrative bureaucracy, they don't respect that court order, what can the court do? The court does not have its police system, the court does not have any military authority, the court does not have any power. Therefore, the only way left is protests. Even looking at some of the legislative provisions in Kenya, when you want to challenge an act of parliament, there is this system called public participation, where before parliament passes legislation, they need to solicit the views of the population. They need to publicize the bill that they want to pass into law. They need to invite comments from the public, and then they need to listen to those comments and take them into account when passing the bill. So just before the Finance Bill 2024, they did provide such an avenue of public participation. People could write in and give their comments on the bill. They did it. Okay. However, the parliament did not take into account any of these comments, and they continued to pass the bill nonetheless. Therefore, this was a violation of the constitutional provision that we need to take into account public participation anytime you enact legislation. And so, what can the people do? The only option left for the people is to go for protests.
Okay, so in 2024, June 25th, June 2024, there was a sort of protest where the Parliament House was stormed. Is it as a result of what you just mentioned, or that is also another thing? And also what we want to know is that particular protest, was it as a result of the opposition spearheading this protest, or is the entire citizenry?
The government would have you believe that this is a project initiated by the opposition. But what is interesting is that this is a very organic protest that came about from the mobilization of the people through social media. Now, normally and traditionally, people in Kenya weren't as engaged politically. This is because, and especially the youth, that is, people never used to watch the news, or if they used to watch the news, it was always a very superficial engagement with the politics of the day. This is the very reason why we have been getting politicians such as the current president in power, because the youth, who are supposedly the most intellectual and the most educated, are usually not very interested in the political situation of the country. But now, because of the eruption of this news over social media, the mobilization of information through the tweets, through the TikToks, the breakdowns that people were posting, the YouTube videos, some people went as far as to translate the provisions and the effects of the finance bill into the local languages, into the vernacular languages, so that people from the countryside could be able to understand this. So because of this new trend that was created on social media, even the younger people who don't normally watch the news were forced to understand that this bill would be very impactful on their day-to-day lives. And this is exactly the reason why the protests were so widespread, why the protests were so successful in terms of getting people out there. So it was very difficult for the political elite to understand that this is not one of those usual times where it is the opposition that is mobilizing people for protests, which is usually the case in Kenya. One of the most famous opposition leaders we have is Raila Odinga, who has always been on the opposition side for about 2 decades now. And every time there's a new administration, he is the first one to call for protests, or as they are commonly and popularly known in Kenya, maandamano. And so it has always been assumed that he is the gatekeeper of protesting in Kenya. And so because these finance bill protests were a new revolutionary wave of protests, the government could not understand where this was coming from. So their default response was to pin it on the opposition. This is a plot by the opposition. And I think this was the first biggest strategic mistake, to think that these were like the other protests by the opposition, where you could call the opposition to the table, you could cut them in on a government deal, share national resources, get into some form of coalition or another, and then suppress the protests. Because that is exactly what they tried to do. They tried to call the opposition leader, Raila Odinga, to the table, try to cut him into the government, just like he had done in the previous administrations, but then nothing changed. In fact, the population became even more enraged, because now you had the popular doyen of opposition politics now in bed with the government, he was traditionally on their side. And so this again inflamed the tensions in the country, because it was now not just the Ruto administration, it was the entire political establishment as a whole. Government side, opposition side, everyone was the enemy of the people, because it now became not one tribe against another tribe, not one faction in the country against another faction, but the whole people against the one government.
Okay. Yes. I think you just answered my next question that I wanted to ask. Does it have any affiliation with tribes? But you just made mention of it, that this is just a clear protest, has nothing to do with tribalism, but just to put the politicians on their toes. Now, having done all these protests, we have seen gunshots being fired in the streets of Nairobi. I stand to be corrected. Recently, we saw a young man who sells a nose mask, and in the course of him hawking, he was shot dead, and that also led to a protest. Are the police taking matters into their own hands, or they are being instructed by the government? Because most of the times, some of these military people or the police, the law enforcers, chance on whatever that is happening during protests to take things into their own hands. Are the police on the side of the people, or they are also on the side of the government?
I would say this is the next strategic mistake that the government made, trying to combat the protests using violent force. We have a constitution that protects the right of people to protest. We have a constitution that protects the right of the people to air out their views and to challenge the government of the day. That is what democracy looks like. That is what our current constitutional dispensation provides for. But despite this, again, a government that is traditionally flouting constitutional values, that is flouting provisions of the law, it is no surprise that they continue to do so even now when faced with protests. Initially, the police began harassing protesters using tear gas, using batons, using whips, trying to suppress the protests on the streets. They were dividing protesters into different sections of the city. They were cornering them, beating them, forcing people away from the city center, using all means at their disposal. Yet the people are not deterred. They continued pressing on. People braved the tear gas. People were very innovative in combating the effects of the tear gas. Numerous guides and tips and tricks were being shared as to how to negate the effects of tear gas to be able to more effectively participate in the protests. So people innovated, they grew, and the protests were not suppressed. Then the police graduated. From using tear gas, from using batons, rungus, whips, they started now using rubber bullets in order to scare people, in order to intimidate people in the protests. Some people were hurt. Because even though rubber bullets are not as lethal as live bullets, they still inflict a considerable amount of pain. Yet the people were not deterred. The protests did not die down. Then the police graduated to their most lethal form, live bullets. They started firing live bullets on unarmed protesters in the city center, which is one of the worst things you can do as a government facing revolutionary tensions in the country. And this is, as I said, the next strategic mistake that they made, because up until now, it was simply a protest against, against a corrupt government, against new taxes. But then it also now graduated into a protest against police brutality, against a violent state, against extrajudicial killings, against murder. This is several degrees higher than protests simply against the cost of living, simply for economic reasons. And so we have a situation where the anger is much more than it was before, because not only are you making us suffer by taking away our money, by taking away our ability to earn and to live to live in economic prosperity, you're also taking away our lives. You're also taking away our freedom and liberty, because you are now abducting people who have voiced dissent against the government. You are now abducting people who are participating in the protests. You're abducting them. You are not producing them before a court if they have been suspected or accused of committing a crime. You're holding them extrajudicially. So this is several degrees worse than it was before, and this is what escalated the protest to the point where it is a complete and consistent onslaught against the regime. It did not end in June 25th, 2024. It continued up until the present day. No wonder the June 25th, 2025 protests, 1 year down the line, are even bigger than the June 24th protests. One would have thought that the government would have learned something from those protests, but they did not. In fact, what happened after those protests was that the president tried to send back the finance bill to parliament. He wanted to make a show of listening to the voices of Kenyans and listening to what their problems were. And so he refused to sign the finance bill. And then he thought that this would be enough it would be enough to make the population settle down. But then, you see, it had already long since stopped being about the finance bill. It had been about his government. It had been about systemic corruption in government. It had been about bad, poor governance among the political elites. It had been about crimes against humanity committed not just this time, but also previous times in other violent clashes that have happened in Kenya. And so the call was not for the finance bill now, it was for Ruto to go. And so him declining to sign the finance bill did not stifle the protests. They went on. He tried to dismiss his cabinet because he thought that, okay, maybe the people are against the cabinet that is in charge of administering the country. But that was not it. It was his government. It was him. He needed to go. And that's why the protest continued. He tried to go on rallies, trying to talk to people and telling them that he has heard them, that he is going to allocate X money and Y money to projects to help youth employment, to allocate money for development projects in areas controlled by the opposition, because he was under the impression that these were the things that people now cared about. But no, there was a problem with the system that needed to go. It couldn't be solved by throwing little chunks of hope at people. The whole system needed to come down. And that's why until June 25th, 2025.
Okay, now we've understood where the protest is coming from. And with all this thing going on, is there any person who is ready to take charge if the government is gone, if the current administration is gone? Because from the look of things, we can tell you want to change the entire system. Are the protesters having someone who is ready to replace them to make sure that all these things happening in the country can be changed? The systems, the institutions, corrupt institutions, everything will be collapsed and start building from afresh. Simply, what I'm trying to say is there any third force that is willing to assume power after doing all these protests? Because if it happens that you do the protests and the government says, we've heard you, we want to change, these are the same people occupying the position. And change does not happen in a day. So definitely corruption is going to go on. Definitely they are still going to loot the government coffers. Definitely they are still going to find another way to introduce different taxes in different forms. Is there any third force ready to assume political power?
That's now a very interesting question, and I think this is where the protesters' opinions and their views and their objectives diverge. This is because you have some people who are calling for a complete overthrow of the government. They think that nothing can be achieved through constitutional means because it has long since passed that point. They do not want to wait for the next elections in order to try and vote out the current administration. They do not want to use any constitutional means to try and get the government out of power. They want an overthrow of the government. Now for that, I'm not entirely sure how that would unfold. You can understand that there is a great deal of uncertainty that comes with unconstitutional or extra constitutional overthrows of governments. Most of the time, it ends up in a situation where you have anarchy, where you have political instability, as we see so many times in African countries, where we celebrate the overthrow of a government only for something even worse to take its place.
Exactly.
We find military coups, military dictators. Sometimes you have civil war. Sometimes you have warlords splitting up the country and devastating the nation in the process, even though this was initially celebrated. So this is not something I would support when it comes to the solutions to the current problem. Every revolution is initially, it's initially seen as something positive, but then one of the greatest commentators of the French Revolution once said that the revolution always eats its children. The ones at the front will suffer the first ones. Everybody who celebrated the revolution will suffer because once the wheels of revolution are let loose, there's no saying where it will go, where you're headed, and where the country is going to end up. And so it's opening up a can of worms that nobody completely understands. Now, there is another group that want to try to continue and challenge the government through constitutional means. They want to keep up the pressure of protests. They want to use these protests to demonstrate the situation of Kenya, for example, on the international stage. Yeah. They want ambassadors, diplomats to pressure their own governments to try to put more pressure on the president to resign. They want, for example, investors to pull out, which means that the administration will be under pressure to reform, that the administration will be under pressure to resign. So this, I think, is something that might work, but up until now, the administration has not shown anything actually that would make it seem that like it would respond to such international pressure. The most likely outcome would be that they would bury their heads in the sand, even if international organizations, human rights organizations, foreign governments continue screaming about human rights violations in Kenya. They don't seem to care. They don't seem to notice, nor will they respond to this pressure, unless international funding starts to stop. I think that is when now the political system will be forced to reform. If foreign governments do not lend money to Kenya, if the IMF or the World Bank do not continue giving monetary support in form of loans to Kenya, then that will be one of the things that helps us to actually get out of this situation. In fact, about 20-30 years before, when there was another dictatorial president, President Moi, was faced with the same level of protests because he had changed the country system from a multi-party state to a one-party state, his own party. Despite the fact that there were protests, one of the biggest reasons why the administration actually reformed was because of international pressure, and specifically cutting off the funding from donors, because at the end of the day, it is money that talks. If the country cannot run, if the government cannot implement its budget or its programs, then they will be forced to reform. And I think this is a very optimistic way to look at it. Now, the last group of people want to wait until the next election cycle, which is in 2027. They have optimism that in 2027, because of the awakening, the political awakening, so to say, in Kenya, that the 2027 elections will get people out to vote. They will make their voice heard, loud and clear. The entire system will change because all of these corrupt politicians, all of these people in the political establishment will be voted out. Again, this I think is optimistic because, for one thing, it is not above the current president to attempt to manipulate the elections in 2027, and he might well do so. And if he does, then we actually don't know what the plan would be for the people who want to wait until 2027, for the people who want to wait until the next election cycle, because they think it is their best bet. We do not know what the result would be if the government decides not to play by the book, not to play by the rules. Again, another thing is that in as much as there has been a political awakening, there is also a large segment of the population that still thinks along the traditional tribal lines in terms of political voting. Yeah. They may well go to the polls in 2027 and re-elect the same people who got us into this mess. They might vote against the president, but then they might vote for their traditional tribal kingpins who are now taking advantage of the opportunity and putting themselves in the opposition and galvanizing the different tribal factions. And so we might be changing out one dictator for another dictator, but simply from another tribe. And again, as I said, the very reason why these protests got to where they were is because it was not about one man, it was not about one tribe, it was a national movement, a national political awakening to understand that it is not one tribe against another, it is a people against the government.
Okay, so what we now call the Gen Z protests, right?
Yes.
Do you think it will yield any results?
I think it's too soon to tell. We have seen results already. We have seen.
Before you continue, is it stopping anytime soon as well?
No, it is not. Again, the government is making strategic mistakes where it refuses to listen and even cater to some of the easiest grievances of the population. For example, the man who was selling masks, who was shot on the street. One of the easiest moves by the government would be to come out strongly and condemn that, and to make sure that the person who was responsible is prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Yet even that simple thing cannot be done, and this shows that this is a government that is entrenched in its position, that is not willing to alter its position even just a little bit in order to try and assuage the tensions in the country. Some things are within their power, like making sure that police officers who go above and beyond the scope of their responsibilities are prosecuted, yet they are not doing that. Instead, we have government officials from the Ministry of Interior, which is a ministry that coordinates the police, who are coming out and calling for people to respect police officers, who are coming out and calling for police officers to not be intimidated and to even shoot to kill in case they are faced with rowdy protesters. That is not a government that is trying to resolve the situation, but it's trying to exacerbate the situation. And so there is no reason why the protests are going to end anytime soon, because the government is not making any moves. They're taking steps back instead of taking steps forward. In any event, the only result from this will be the protests getting worse. instead of better. Maybe next year's protest will be even bigger, will be even bigger, larger, more violent. In fact, we might not even need to wait until June 25th next year. One can reasonably see large-scale protests erupting again on the streets very, very soon. So they will not end anytime soon. Okay. As for your question about the results, yes, we have seen some results. We have seen that the government is at least intimidated by the power of the population. They have started to blame opposition leaders. They have started to call it a violent coup. But they have started to call it terrorism. This shows that the government is afraid. Now, they are not using that fear to actually help to resolve the situation. They're using that fear to go back a few steps, to become more entrenched in their position. But they are fearing. That's why the president recalled the finance bill. That is why the president started shuffling his cabinet. That is why the president started even reaching across the table to the opposition leaders that he so hated before, because he knows that in order to survive, he needs to unite with all of the opposition, with all of the political elites in the country. So these are moves of a government that is afraid. But in terms of the long-term results of the protests, as of now, it is too early to tell. We are 1 year into this national political movement, and I think it is only within the next 2 years, and particularly the election cycle, where we will see whether these protests have actually awakened the political situation of Kenyans, where we can see the results when they go out to vote. Have they changed their mentality? Have we started to understand that the business of government is our business? Have we started to understand that this is not about tribes or ethnic groups? Have we started to understand corruption? Have we started to understand our civic duties? We can only see that in 2027, and I think it will be a very interesting thing to watch out for.
Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate this has been one of the best conversations I've had this year, and I really appreciate you being here. Any last words for the people of Kenya?
Keep pushing. I have been very amazed at the strength and the camaraderie of Kenyans in these trying times, and this is something I never thought would happen, at least not in my lifetime, because political engagement has never been the strong suit of Kenyans. And when people came out and took the time to understand things that they did not previously know, they took the time to look at a bill that was dozens of pages long in order to read it and to understand it. People who are not lawyers, people who are not social scientists, they're not economists. They sat down and read the bill. They went out onto the streets to protest. They keep going out onto the streets. They keep leaving their jobs. They keep closing down their businesses so that they can go and participate politically. It gives hope, not just for Kenya, but for other African nations who are also facing the same problems.
Definitely.
And so I think the message is to keep pushing.
Okay, so all Kenyans, the message to you is to keep pushing. We are trying to get someone from Togo to discuss what is also currently happening in Togo. So keep watching, make sure you stay tuned and subscribe to the channel. There are lots of things that we will bring to you. This is your boy Wofadino, and keep watching.